Welcome, everybody. This is Rev. It's the moment you all haven't been waiting for. These videos have been a total flop. Um, but I'm going to finish it out. We are doing Chapter 7 called Metagames from Patty Hobbs' book, Road to the King. And the conclusion. The conclusion really, it's like a one-pager. It just says, hey, I want to pass the baton and, be a lifelong learner and inspire you as a teacher, yada yada. There's really not much of substance to it, but I will go through as speedily as possible some of the key themes from metagames, the chapter titled Metagames. As a reminder, if you like content or you want to support the channel or retro communities, subscribing is the best way to support. Thank you. All right, so metagames and formats. Here, I've probably sounded like a broken record, but a lot of this mostly applies to more modern um, formats or modern ways to play the game, just because it is significantly more fresh. There's going to be new sets, there's going to be new ban lists, and Patrick goes into some different ways to gain an edge. He defines a metagame, he defines a format, he defines metagaming, all of which I think, if you've ever played Yu-Gi-Oh, need no real explanation. He talks about the different types of formats, one deck formats, two deck formats, so on and so forth, and then the rock, paper, scissors types of formats, um, where one beats the other, yada, 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 so on and so forth. Um, so he also talks about something called a format ceiling, which I think is kind of interesting, which is that at some point in the format, the ceiling will be reached, which is just like the most refined, most powerful, optimized version of a deck. Um, Personally, I highly doubt most modern formats, at the time of writing this book at least, ever reach that point. I just don't think there's any way, with like most formats only being, several months to half a year long, that you're ever going to reach the actual ceiling of a format. Just like thinking how long it took GOAT format to reach its ceiling, which is like a hyper optimized Chaos Turbo list. Edison's been being played, for years, and it still hasn't reached that ceiling. So, I think the actual ceiling probably isn't reached that frequently. I think like the in practice ceiling, like versus what's actually doable with the limited amount of time and place testing you have, probably does get reached in most uh, formats. And he talks about some like one-off stuff like how those progress with time and like different regional differences. Um, like is like or I don't know. I don't think they're I've never traveled for Yu-Gi-Oh, so I don't really know if there are huge regional differences, but he talks about how OCG tournaments do heavily influence the first tournaments after a TCG release, which I think makes intuitive sense just because they see those cards earlier. Um, and that as TCG formats progress, those OCG format wins become less and less relevant. He says that North American players are generally more willing to take risks because we have more events to go to. In Europe, those events are less frequent and more spread out across different geographies. So, if you only have one chance to play in a tournament, you're probably going to play something a little bit more standard as opposed to like if you're in the US, you can like go to a tournament, like a big tournament, like twice a month at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh, which I think also makes sense. Um, He says that the first event of the format determines the format moving forward, which I think is true. Uh, he's calling these, by the way, format evaluation rules. He says average players determine the standard, which I think is true. I mean, just by the nature of it, there are going to be more average players that kind of set what the pace is for the format. Um, and then top players also heavily, pardon me, influence the format, and most players are risk averse, so they will more or less, he says, kind of be sheep and play something that's tried and true. Um, I don't want to literally read these all word for word, or else I'll spend the next 30 minutes talking about all of these rules. Um, but something that he talks about are various deck building rules. Uh, one of these being minor changes lead to only incremental advantages and are not enough to consistently win tournaments. So that's like one or two tech cards being put in there. He says you kind of have to go gung ho and like find something that's going to really really give you an edge. Like something that he talks about is the innovation of using super polymerization in shadows at the time was huge in the mirror, and it like made the mirror like completely degenerate, sadly. As well as I think was it Puppet Plant as well. I can't remember. I did play that format for like a month or two, just like peeking my head in the door at Yu-Gi-Oh at the time, so I can't remember the exact cards, but I gave him a huge advantage at the time. Um, but like very small changes aren't going to like give you that edge to like just run through a tournament, like Patrick did, like when he was on his run. Like he usually would find like one to two really, really big things that gave him a massive edge, hide them, conceal them, and then bust them out in a tournament that he wanted to win. Which kind of leads to some other points that he makes about like timing, which is, uh, concealing those. Like if you like, he intentionally sometimes would play a deck prior to a big tournament just not to show it, or play a suboptimal deck so that other people would copy him, and then he could then subsequently beat a suboptimal deck because he was such a name brand at that point that people would just clone his decks. And then another thing that I think actually is very uh, important and maybe obvious is that a bad matchup shouldn't dictate the way we build our deck if those bad matchups aren't played. So he just says like if your deck has a really bad matchup and nobody plays it, you really just shouldn't pay attention to it and just take those losses as they come. Um, and you should you know put the emphasis on preparation on what will actually be played, which I think again is very obvious, but sometimes people hyper focus on what their deck's weakness is and they don't really take into consideration how represented that weakness is in the rest of the tournament, so they'll hyper focus on it and then just do more harm than good. Um, yeah. So what was the next portion here? I'm gonna thumb through this real quick. Um, yeah, this is basically the same point. He says when deciding which deck to main deck against, we should have a preference for the more represented deck, and he goes into some interesting examples with this on like how he geared his main deck to like basically auto lose to certain things and then auto win against other things and not kind of split the difference based on not only the representation but like how hard he would lose to those anyway, which was like I can't remember the exact deck, but there was like one deck where like you could main a dark hole to have an out to something that they were going to put on the board in game one, but if they put that on the board in game one anyway, you're like already largely unfavored. So it's like it's one of those lose by less decisions. It's like yeah, you might win a very small percentage of those games, but you might as well just like auto win other matchups and just punt game one. Um, and I think that's kind of happening honestly in Go format. Like if you've kind of kept up with the meta, the decks are getting more and more inbred with like focusing on beating themselves, namely Chaos Turbo. Um, and it's just like focusing like solely on beating itself, which I think is interesting. I don't know if it's correct or not, but and then he goes into like certain things about spreading information even mid tournament. He had a few situations where he was running some like weird one-off tech cards, and then information started spreading throughout the tournament as he got more and more notoriety. He went into some examples of how the early rounds of a tournament and even just Swiss as a whole representation is going to be different between that and Top Cut based on sort of rock paper scissors meta, and then like which deck beats which and by how much and what the starting representation is. So um, he has a rule that attempting to counter the meta can make it difficult to survive in Swiss. So it's kind of just a way of saying that anti-meta strategies are usually suboptimal, um, because they usually just beat one deck, um, and you probably aren't going to make it through Swiss in the first place. And this is the same rule as basically the prior one, but said a different way, which is choose the deck with the strongest engine, not the deck with the best counter to the strongest engine, which I think is very true. Um, and this was, going into like some different ideas he had on like the way certain like ARG tournaments worked and like how you could kind of game buys. Like if you just built your deck for the later rounds of Swiss as opposed to the early rounds of Swiss, I don't think those are like real tournament rules. So I'm just not even going to talk about that. That sounds just really weird the way he explained it, that you could like choose buys, unless I'm misunderstanding how those tournaments were run back in the day. Um, and then he also goes into how skill intensive each mirror match is. So um, you want to know like if it has a very skill intensive mirror match, how to prepare for that versus if it's like completely degenerate, like he goes into Cleefort mirror matches, and which deck choice you should choose with that. Because if it's like not a very skill intensive mirror match and you're a good player, you're probably putting yourself at a pretty large disadvantage. And then he goes into format planning, which I think is more the timing of things. I kind of already covered that. There are some very nuanced points that he makes in here about how, the second tournament is usually the most important one, just because the first one's kind of random, if you will. The second one's a little bit more refined, and then people kind of metagame off the second one. Um, he talks about saving ideas. He talks about omitting events, just like not going to them to save an idea, timing those ideas at certain points in the format. Again, I've never taken the game this seriously, so it isn't particularly useful to me, and it's probably not useful to you, considering that like in legacy formats, which is probably all of my viewers, you have a good idea, you just play it. Like it's a evergreen format. Um, and That's really it. I mean, there are other minor points, and then he goes on to the conclusion, which just kind of thanks some people. Talks about passing the baton, and that he doesn't want to be the greatest player of all time. He wants to be the greatest player up until his time, which I thought was an interesting way to put it. But that finally concludes our book review of Road of the King, Patrick Hoban. Um, a lot of this has been about what was in the book. I will, I guess, spend the next minute maybe talking about what my thoughts are on the book and whether or not you should read it. I think if you enjoy the game, you should read it. I can't say it's like revolutionary or groundbreaking, but I think it was really good to get a lot of this stuff in writing. I think if I were a modern player, this would more or less kind of be a Bible if I really took Yu-Gi-Oh super duper seriously and wanted to be like one of the best. I think you'd have to read this, and you'd probably want to read it like once a year. Um, I think it's a considerably less relevant for the formats that I play, but I still do think I'm better off having read it. So if any of these videos did pique your interest, I think it would be worth the read. Um, and I do think it is worth getting into the mind of somebody that probably took this game more seriously than anybody um, that I can think of, at least. I mean, maybe there are a handful of players that took it this seriously, and just what level of thought he put into every aspect of the game, and not just like how you play your cards or what cards you play, but like really a lot of the less tangible stuff I think was really interesting. So that concludes this. Thank you for watching, guys. I appreciate you. See ya.